Welcome to our three-part colorism series with the Racial Unity team. My name is Tanisha Johnson. I'm on the board of RUT. Today, in the second session of this series, we are discussing Coloring Outside the Lines, a literary exploration of colorism and girlhood with Professor Baumgartner. I'd just like to give a thank you to our grantors, New Hampshire Humanities and Kennebunk Savings. I also want to give a thank you to SAU 16 for their support in this program. We want to also thank our presenters for joining us on this panel, and a special thank you to the RUT board chair for organizing this amazing series. Just a few Zoom rules for today. We are recording this program so that we can post this event to our webpage for others to view. If you would not like your face to be visible, please turn off the video for your Zoom. Please make sure your mics are muted during the discussion. Be mindful of others, as there's a large amount of individuals and background noises will interrupt the speaker. We will be using the chat function of this Zoom. Please feel free to post a question or feedback in the chat section. We will then ask your questions at the end of the presentation. If we have time to open it up for Q&A to read out loud, then we will. And also, if you must leave early, please feel free to do so without interrupting the panel. I would like to now introduce our moderator and presenter for the series, Professor Kabria Baumgartner. She is an associate professor of English and American Studies at the University of New Hampshire. She is the author of the award-winning book, In Pursuit of Knowledge, Black Women in Educational Activism in Antebellum America, which tells the story of African-American girls and women who fought to democratize public and private schools in the 19th century Northeast. She is currently writing a biography of Robert Morris, one of the first African-American lawyers in the United States. I turn it over to you. For some reason we can't hear you. Am I the only one?
Can you hear me now? Yes? Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Tanisha, for that welcome. I was saying that I had a very long night last night as I heard about the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So in many ways, thinking about what she fought for in terms of justice and women's rights, I do think in some ways this discussion will touch upon some of those themes. And so we'll look at some literary, look at a literary text, but we'll also have two guests who will talk about their own experiences. So last week, Professor Bell gave a wonderful talk framing the historical points related to the origins of colorism in the United States, but also globally. And this conversation today really builds on that talk. As I said, it'll be part literary exploration and also part personal reflection. I'll discuss Toni Morrison's novel, The Bluest Eye, to probe the impact of colorism on Black girls. And then we'll be joined by Ken Mendes and Amanda Graves, who will share their insights. And so I will invite them into the conversation in just a little bit. So I wanted to, kind of have a prop, I guess, for this, for the beginning of this, which is, you guys can all see this, right? Let's see, if my background works. So this is a paper bag, right? Can you all see it? And if we think about paper bags, we're probably thinking about, I can hold it up, there we go. If we think about paper bags, we're probably thinking about just a bag that we put our lunch in, right? Or something that holds goods. We're probably thinking about something that is totally benign. And, as I bring it and as I don't know if you can see it because my background is a little different, but imagine then that it's a paper bag. And if you're thinking about my skin color, my complexion, right, it's quite a bit darker than this paper bag. And so something as benign, as innocuous as a paper bag, though, was used to exclude people. So that means if we were in the 20th century, if I were trying to enter an African-American social organization, I would have failed the brown paper bag test. So that brown paper bag test was a documented practice among African-American social organizations and even religious institutions in the 20th century. If your skin color was lighter than a brown paper bag, you were more acceptable and worthier of joining a certain social organization. So think about college fraternities and sororities. If your skin color was darker, right, you would be excluded from those organizations. So in some cities and towns in the United States, your access to social events, to employment, and so on was going to be predicated upon your complexion. And that really defines colorism, right? In an essay from her book, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, Alice Walker defines colorism as, quote, prejudicial treatment or preferential treatment of same race people based solely on their skin color. And then Walker goes on to add that oftentimes this means privileging light skin over dark skin. So I think it's pretty clear with the paper bag test and other forms of determining, right, and judging somebody's skin color, that skin color matters. And I would argue that there's a link between colorism and racism. So last week we quoted Lupita Nyong'o, the Black actor and filmmaker, and she said that colorism is the daughter of racism in a world that rewards lighter skin over darker skin. So in various interviews, Lupita, who's a dark-skinned woman and who I would add is quite beautiful, has described the challenges that she experienced. She was born in Mexico and then we went back to Kenya, so she kind of grew up in Kenya. And then she later had to navigate Hollywood as a darker skinned woman. So she was inspired to write the children's book, Soulway, about a darker skinned girl who learns to love herself. So that's one of the books that I highly recommend that we read to our children. So the link between colorism and racism is important to understand for two reasons. One is that colorism and racism are part of a caste system, right? I'll say that again, colorism and racism are part of a caste system. And second, this caste system ultimately fuels whiteness, right? This caste system ultimately fuels whiteness. So as my colleague Chanda Prescott-Weinstein has said and written elsewhere, colorism helps determine the extent to which racism hurts Black people, right? So if you're a lighter skinned Black person, right, you may not bear the brunt of racist acts, although you still might experience racism. It might be in a different form or might be a different level. She said, colorism means that some people, some Black people, are harmed by anti-Blackness more than others, but ultimately whiteness wins. So using some of that, that discussion, right, those three Black women talking about colorism and racism, I want us to think about the impact of something like the brown paper bag test, right? What happened when you, as a dark-skinned Black woman or Black girl, failed the brown paper bag test, right? When you failed in your proximity to whiteness? What was a dark-skinned Black girl's fate in the mid-20th century? So these kinds of questions actually motivated Toni Morrison, right, to write The Bluest Eye, which was her first published novel. This year is the 50th anniversary of that. So there have been some programming, there's been some programming celebrating this remarkable anniversary. Toni Morrison said of this book, quote, "I focus on something as grotesque as the demonization of an entire race, and that demonization could take root inside the most delicate member of society, a child, and the most vulnerable member, a female." So in this novel, The Bluest Eye, Toni Morrison explores what it means, what this vulnerability means, what it means especially for a dark-skinned Black girl. It's set in Lorain, Ohio, which was Toni Morrison's birthplace. It's where she grew up. So Lorain, Ohio, 1940s. And it tells the story of Pecola Breedlove, a dark-skinned 11-year-old Black girl who prays for blue eyes so that she can be seen as beautiful and as worthy. When Pecola was born, her mother, Pauline, said, "I know she was ugly. Head full of pretty hair, but Lord, was she ugly." So Pecola becomes this little Black girl who wanted to rise up out of the pit of her Blackness and see the world with blue eyes. So that's why she prays for blue eyes. From her parents, of course, Pecola learned to loathe her eye color, her skin color, and her race. But she also learned this self-loathing through various social interactions, Morrison tells us. So throughout the book, we get a sense of these social interactions. There's a moment where Pecola buys a piece of candy at a store. And that moment is fraught with prejudice and disgust. The storekeeper is very aggressive with Pecola, and all Pecola can think of is basically, if I were white, would I be treated like this? If I had lighter skin, would I be treated like this? On the schoolyard, Pecola is teased by her classmates, and this would be actually her Black classmates. And they call her Blackie Mo, Blackie Mo, and they're hurling these insults at her. So it's the way that she is treated, right? That she internalizes this rejection, she internalizes this isolation. But on the flip side, she also observes how others are treated, especially those with lighter skin or white skin. So there's one scene in particular that I want to read from the novel, because I think it really gets at the heart of how impactful colorism can be on one of the most vulnerable members of society. So this is a moment that's pretty early in the novel, when Pecola and her friends, Claudia and Frida, meet another character named Maureen Peel for the first time. And it's really quite interesting how Morrison describes Maureen Peel through Claudia, right, who's one of the other Black girls in the novel. Claudia is the narrator here, and she describes the enchanting Maureen. And here's what she says. "A high yellow dream child with long brown hair braided into 2 lynch ropes that hung down her back. She was rich, at least by our standards, as rich as the richest of the white girls, swaddled in comfort and care. The quality of her clothes threatened to derange Frida and me. Patent leather shoes with buckles, a cheaper version of which we could only get at Easter, and which had disintegrated by the end of May. Fluffy sweaters, the color of lemon drops, tucked into skirts with pleats, so orderly they astounded us. Brightly colored knee socks with white borders, a brown velvet coat trimmed in white rabbit fur, and a matching muff. There was a hint of spring in her green eyes, something summery in her complexion, and a rich autumn ripeness in her walk. If she was cute, and if anything could be believed she was, then we were not. And what did that mean? We were lesser. Nicer, brighter, but lesser. Dolls we could destroy, but we could not destroy the honey voices of parents and aunts, the obedience in the eyes of our peers, the slippery light in the eyes of our teachers when they encounter the Maureen Peels of the world? What was the secret? What did we lack? Why was it important? And so what? And all the time we knew that Maureen Peel was not the enemy and not worthy of such intense hatred. The thing to fear was the thing that made her beautiful and not us. And so that's, to me, one of the more evocative moments in the novel that really speaks to the impact of colorism, where these young Black girls are questioning themselves. They're getting this sort of challenge to their own self-esteem because they're seeing the way in which someone who's lighter skinned is treated compared to them, right? That they are darker skinned. And so the thing that Morrison is talking about here are white standards of beauty, white standards of dress, right? She's interested too in talking about issues of class. So Maureen Peel is somebody who is rich. All these things combined, really puts Maureen Peel on a pedestal, right? And all Pecola and Claudia and Frida can do is really look up to her and wish that they could be her. So the lighter skinned Maureen receives adulation and admiration, remember, from the parents and the teachers with whom she interacts. But Pecola, on the other hand, is denigrated, right? So Maureen Peel then in this moment in the novel is not just registering this racial hostility, but she's also registering this colorism, right? And this scene then becomes evidence of the harmful effects of prejudicial treatment, right? Which can cause Black children to develop a sense of self-hatred. So Morrison's novel, to me, is really quite sobering. I did not read it as, I didn't read it in middle school or anything like that, although I know some teachers do assign it. I read it as an adult, which made it more manageable for me because it does, there are scenes of sexual assault and rape that make it a very difficult novel. I think a lot of what Morrison is trying to do is she's trying to expose this nightmare, right? This alienation and isolation that a dark-skinned Black girl experiences. She's trying to break this taboo of silence, and she's trying to open our eyes so that we can bear witness to what these young girls are experiencing. In a lot of ways, she's saying to us, we cannot look away and we must not look away. But I also find hope, if we want to call it that, in Morrison's work. And I think she's sort of providing us some clues, some ways forward in the novel. And so I want to talk about those quickly. So in the context of the novel, Morrison says it, and it's pretty clear, we, the collective we, society, failed Pecola, right? Within the novel, she is irretrievably broken. She is shattered. Morrison writes, she has stepped over into madness. So there's really no way to rescue Pecola after all that has been done to her. But I think what Morrison is saying is there are alternatives that we can, quote unquote, fix this, right? And one of the ways to fix this is to tell the truth about it, right? That's actually one of the most powerful ways to fix it. I also think she's saying that we have to resist reproducing the mythologies that we often cling to in order to be comfortable. So if you think about beauty standards, right? I was just reading a very short quote from Nina Simone, right? The famed singer, who's saying that she would never be featured on some of the magazines, right? That were circulating, right? Because she was darker skinned. They'd rather have Diana Ross on the cover. So we have to really push back and reject and resist the reproduction of these mythologies, especially in popular culture. I also think what Morrison is saying is that we have to reject anti-Blackness. And anti-Blackness is generally defined as opposition and hostility toward people of African descent. So at every time we see anti-Blackness, we need to be rejecting it, right? And remember that when Morrison wrote this novel in 1970, she wrote it amid the Black is Beautiful campaign, right? The Black is Beautiful movement. So she's showing us another side of that, and actually she's contextualizing it for us. The reason why we need to say Black is beautiful is because there's always so many challenges, so much anti-Blackness that comes with that. And I'm also reminded of other in the 70s and even the 60s of Black artists, right, who were celebrating Blackness in the mid-20th century. I'm thinking of people like James Brown, right, who would say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud. And the reason why we need those reminders, right, is because of the constant assault from society that Blackness is ugly, that Blackness is degraded, so on and so forth. So I can't help but think of the work of poet Lucille Clifton, who is a contemporary, of course, of Morrison's. She was the poet laureate of Maryland, just a really great poet. I highly recommend reading some of her poetry. She has a poem called What the Mirror Said. And it's a poem that really celebrates the richness of Blackness. And I feel like it's a poem that Pecola Breedlove needed to hear and needed to speak, right? She needed to say it. If she could have only have heard some of these pronouncements about her own beauty and the beauty of Blackness. So in the last couple of seconds here that I have, I want to read it to you. And as I'm reading the poem, please listen to the rhythm, right? The attitude and the language. This is sort of written in Black vernacular. So this is called What the Mirror Said. Listen, you a wonder. You a city of a woman. You got a geography of your own. Listen, somebody need a map to understand you. Somebody need directions to move around you. Listen, woman, you not a no place anonymous girl. Mister with his hands on you, he got his hands on some damn body. So that's Lucille Clifton, What the Mirror Said. And I just love it because it really is an unapologetic celebration of Blackness. It's defiant, right? There's a total awareness. And I think it's just sort of an assertion of self and of self-worth, right? You're not a no place girl, right? You are somebody. So I think both Morrison and Clifton remind us that we have to challenge the standards by which we even imagine ourselves and by which we regard ourselves, because those standards do us no good, right? They do more harm. And so I wanted us to consider this literary example alongside, I think, the personal reflections of Ken and Amanda. And so I want to invite them into the conversation now, but first I want to introduce them. So we all know Ken. He's the founding member and chair of the board of directors of the Racial Unity team. He's volunteered with many New Hampshire social justice organizations and school districts, as well as the New Hampshire State Board of Education, the governor's office, and the legislature. As a member of the SAU 16 Superintendent David Ryan's anti-discriminatory task force, Ken is charged with helping implement Senate Bill 263 to overcome discrimination in SAU 16 public schools. In his professional career as global director for quality systems for several Fortune 500 companies, Ken has spent his professional career addressing systemic problems within these organizations. Approaching these issues from a what-if root cause perspective, he has helped execute corrective and preventative actions by working closely with those responsible for implementing solutions. He holds a BS in engineering and an MBA in business management. And we also have Amanda Graves, CEO at Max Tech, where she helps clients integrate services and solutions designed for their specific needs. Her specialties include IT strategy and execution, process standardization, and strategic and technical planning. Prior to taking up that position, She worked for 7 years at the Department of Veterans Affairs, where she worked on identity and access protection and security. She has 20 years of experience managing high-tech operating environments. She graduated from the University of Maryland, College Park, with a bachelor's and master's degrees in information technology management. Join me in welcoming Ken and Amanda.
So Ken, do you want me to go ahead?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, good morning, everyone. And thank you, Ken, and the Racial Unity team for inviting me to share my experience on colorism. I had the opportunity to listen to last week's session and learned that racism is much more pervasive than I understood it to be. We all know that we all know about slavery and Jim Crow, etc., but it's a narrow view. We think we understand racism, but colorism puts it in such a perspective that it relates and applies to so many levels that we have seen around the world. Last week's session opened my eyes to different aspects of racism. When there was an outcry from my friends and people around me about racial inequality in the US and the recent protests all over the country, I started to think about my own situation, being a very dark-skinned Indian in Malaysia. I was born in Kerala and grew up in Malaysia. You all know Indians, just like all dark-skinned people, come in varying skin tones. I was the darkest in the family of 9 children. I was called the Blackie. Even in my own house growing up, my father had his favorites. All the lighter skinned kids were favored over the dark skinned. In school, I distinctly remember an incident in the 2nd grade where we called Standard 2. It was a British system, when the teacher, who was a nun, was teaching about dates and clocks and time. And she asked the class, how many seconds in a minute? I raised my hand and I said 60 seconds. She went on to ask, how many minutes in an hour? No one put up their hand, and so I put it up, and again, I put up my hand again, and she was not happy. She appeared upset. She practically dismissed me, and I had the answer, so I told her the answer, and she said, oh, you think you're so smart. I have never forgotten that incident. Instead of encouraging me, she suppressed me. And so some teachers were not kind because I was so dark, never involved or encouraged me. I was devalued. I believe as a child, I suppressed the pain. Children usually dismiss pain quickly and move on. And I think that's what I did. I just, I was a happy child at home. I just dismissed it. It was hard for me in school. I couldn't show my potential. When babies are born to an Indian family in Malaysia or in India, the first question is the baby fair? Not if the baby is healthy. I mean, it was so important to them that the baby was fair. White, as you all know, I think last week somebody had mentioned, whitening creams have a big market all over Malaysia and Asia. It is a big industry, major industry in India. Light skin was a sign of beauty. My light-skinned sisters, there was varying skin types in my household, had boyfriends. I was too dark. Malaysian men were not interested. Several of my nephews refused to date or marry dark-skinned Indian females. They marry Chinese, they marry Filipinos, or someone with light skin. So I was very lucky to have met my husband, an American Peace Corps volunteer from Maine in Malaysia. He loved, and he was my champion. He stood by me. After getting married, I changed. I became confident and strong. He was my rock. I had somebody to back me. I saw life differently. I was very lucky to have had him as my support and sponsor. Nobody bothered me. I was strong and was able to stand up to anyone. My true self matured. When we were moving to Maine, I was continuously told in Malaysia that I would be very badly treated in the US because I was very dark. So I had to work up an attitude. I said to myself that if I'm treated badly, I will ignore it because it was not my problem, it was their problem. Throughout my career in the US government, this is the attitude that I used. I never allowed myself to be bothered by racial issues, at least personal racial issues. And because of that, I never personally felt the racism here in the US. At least I was not aware, but I was very aware of my dark skin in Malaysia. In Malaysia today, advertisements only use light-skinned Asians or a lot of Caucasians. We go to Malaysia and we see these billboards full of Caucasians, and I'm like, wait a minute, why are they using Caucasians in their billboards? Companies hiring for modeling jobs. This year, I have seen it. Jobs or customer-facing positions often state Indians do not apply. Don't bother to apply for the position. What is interesting is that so many beautiful Indian females in Malaysia, several have become Miss Malaysia, and in the recent years have been Indians, Malaysian Indians. However, they are all light-skinned Indians. So how do you get people to accept you for who you are as an individual and not judge you for how you look? I hear about Ken's initiatives to integrate it into schools. We need to capture them really young. And I really want to read your book that you suggested about the blue eye. What is it? And so, to include diversity and awareness in schools and the university curriculum that Ken is working on. I hope the racial unity group will be adopted by communities all over the country and better still all over the world. I would really like to be involved in it. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Amanda and her father and my father used to like to play poker. That's why I know Amanda, although we never met in Malaysia, we met here several years later. My reflection, I'm not going to go into the history of my racial incidents, events in this country. They are no different from a lot of things that you know, but I want to talk about how I have tried to move forward in my time here. So I'm going to talk about race and color because they are intertwined in some way. I want to talk to you today about how race and color of my skin has played a role in who I am today and the challenges I face. We live in a multicultural, diverse society, but race and skin color are still a very sensitive topic to talk about. I was born in Malaysia, and I am of Sri Lankan ancestry. My last name is Mendes. And if you think about that, many people think it's Spanish, or maybe from South America, but the Spanish were in South America. But in reality, the Portuguese occupied Sri Lanka for 150 years, from 1505 to 1658. In that 150 years, somehow that Portuguese name of Mendes was integrated into my last name. And there's a history behind it. I'm going to try something here and see whether I can share my screen with you. I got a couple of slides I want to share with you. So let me do that very quickly. Right. So I decided some time ago that I really wanted to find out about my ancestry. And so I took a DNA test. And if you can see from this graph here, you're seeing my screen, everybody?
Yes.
Yep. All right. My DNA test came back that I was from the Indian subcontinent. And the history goes that somewhere along the line, several centuries ago, an Indian prince was driven away from his country in the north, and he came down to Sri Lanka. So that's why my DNA test shows my ancestry being from this continent. I always thought growing up that since I had the name of Mendes, that somehow, somewhere along the line, like what happened in the US, we adopted or, somebody got pregnant with a child and the name Mendes came up. But my DNA test had no Portuguese blood in me. It was a 100% from the subcontinent of India. Now, that gave me some impetus to say, you know what? That's an interesting view that I have no, I'm thoroughbred, put it that way, when you're thinking of horses, right? So having lived in the US for almost 5-6 decades, I'm guilty of ignoring my own race and the color. For a long time, I tried to fit in. Most people try to do that. They try to fit in. I wanted to be known for my achievements, and not because I would look different. I wanted to avoid any racial biases and suggestion of brown privileges and any stereotypical associations. We all think the Indians are smart, they're mathematicians, they're engineers, they're doctors and things like that. I wanted to avoid that. I wanted people to accept me for who I was. And so I downplayed my race in a very big way. And so I avoided talking about my race to others. But in doing so, I also avoided a conversation about race and the color of my skin with my children, who were born in the US to a mother from New York who's white. And I know many other immigrant parents who have done the same, not talk about their race or the color of their skin with their children. And in America, we know that has happened because when I talk to my wife, she says she's from a German background, and her grandmother was looked down upon and really penalized in school for speaking German. So avoid talking about race was one of the things I did, and I know it was wrong because I didn't talk to my children about it. So race and color of your skin is such an ingrained social construct that we can never truly disassociate ourselves from it. People are socially conditioned to assign value to someone based on their skin color. Color matters, race matters. But since the birth of my grandchildren, I've become increasingly conscious about the color, about my background, my heritage. They're biracial, and they do not look like me. And I, again, want to share a slide with you very quickly. So since the birth of my grandchildren, I have become increasingly conscious of the color of my children. They are lighter. And in fact, my grandchildren, as you can see, is a spectrum of colors in my family. So what I've had to do, I have 2 grandchildren in New Hampshire, and they do not live in a multicultural town. And when they were in kindergarten, there were no white children in their nursery. And their neighbors are white. So it worries me because they're not growing in a multicultural environment. And of course, I have a granddaughter in Newton, Mass. And now Newton is the United Nations. You can go into those schools and it's so multicultural in so many different ways. I also recently started looking at the books that they were reading, and I could not find many non-white characters. I mean, most of them are white. Diversity in children's literature is a huge concern. And researchers suggest that, that over 80% of the characters in children's books are white. This doesn't reflect the reality of our world. It does not allow our children to look beyond the stereotypes to understand that their view is never less or more important than someone who is not of the same skin color as theirs, or that they are less important as someone who has blonde hair and blue eyes. And by the way, my grandson, when he was born, was blonde and blue eyed. So the stereotype characters in children's books and in the media present a problem for our young children today. So by dismissing or keeping silent about our race and color, we reinforce the notion that people are not born equal. And this allows children to make their own judgment and inferences about racial inequality based on skin color. By saying that everyone is the same or we are colorblind, we deny our children their own racial cultural experience. And by the way, and I've thought about this, and everybody has a racial cultural experience, whether we are white or whether we are from a different color, we have our racial experience, and children need to know about that. We also dismiss the fact that racism is still a huge issue in many parts of our country, and it whitewashes many of the significant events of racial crimes and segregation in the history of our country by ignoring race. It is important to me that my grandchildren are proud of their ethnic origin and can challenge racial prejudice when they see or encounter it. This is such a complex, multi-layered issue, and I'm hopeful that it is through events like these and others that it raises the conscientiousness and fosters the conversation amongst us all so that we can understand better the world our children will inherit and how we as a people can help prepare them for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda and Ken, for those wonderful words and reflections. I want to open it up to questions. I see we have one question in the chat from Robert Thompson. Ken, I don't know if you can see that question, but I'll go ahead and read it as well. It seems that your attitude about race was personally driven, i.e. not formed in response to American racism. Yet the path of your children and grandchildren seems much more typical. How did you get from there to the racial unity team?
Good question, Bob. It is interesting. I came to the States, United States in '64. My father was a diplomat, and I was supposed to go to Australia to go to school, but he said, Ken, I think you should come here. That's how I ended up coming to the States. That was in '64. Growing up as a male in Malaysia, I can be dark-skinned, but you really don't experience the issues of the women who are dark-skinned and fair, like Amanda spoke. So I had very little concept of racism, other than what was exported by the US to other countries, because racism was, in my mind, exported to other countries as well. And it's from the media and the things that we have seen. So I experienced some form of racism when I came here. I've been stopped by police and people, I remember dating a white girl in college, and people were screaming and yelling at me on the streets. And one incident that really stayed in my mind is I was then going out with a girl from New York who I finally married, but we were in a amusement park and enjoying ourselves, and all of a sudden there was a Coke bottle across the face of across the face of the person I was with, and it was a woman who took that Coke bottle and broke two front teeth of the girl I was with, and said, "Stay with your own kind." So racism happened, and in the '60s there was this problem where black females were feeling that the the black men were being taken by white people, men. The black men were, going after white women, and so they were angry. They were angry. So those are some of the things that help create that and keep me trying to avoid getting into racial issues and trying to achieve my professional career more than anything else. But I see today that especially in New Hampshire, when I first came to New Hampshire, Bob, I opened up the newspaper and first thing I saw the superintendent of schools, not this one, but the one prior to this, saying, we do not have a diversity problem. And I'm saying, but you don't understand the issue. And this is what drove me, Bob, to make it personal, that I felt it was important that I use the knowledge I have to convince people that their children will pay the price because the world is changing and they have to somehow bring diversity. I realized New Hampshire is 96% white, but the children will go into a diverse world and they need to be prepared.
I know that next week we will hear from a preeminent scholar on, beauty, and the title of her presentation, Aria Holiday, is Beauty and the Beholder, Colorism and the Lessons We Teach Our Children. But I just want to sort of ask a question about gender. Because I think, Amanda, you talked about this in your experience, and Ken, you just mentioned it too, that colorism seems to operate slightly differently when we think about and consider gender. I think in the context of Morrison's novel, we see that. We see what it means for Black girls, right? Those who are lighter skinned, those who are darker skinned have different experiences, especially with other boys. But Amanda, you referred to this too, that, you said someone told you were too dark to have a boyfriend, right? And so I want to talk about the gendered implications of colorism and any insights you all can share about that.
Did you want me to talk about it?
Yes, yes.
Well, it was very interesting because in Malaysia, men, Chinese or Indians, they were not interested in me, but they were interested in my sisters, who were the lighter skinned sisters. But what was I was very lucky, like I said earlier, that I was very, very lucky to have met my husband, who was American, and he came from Maine. He had parents were Republican, but he was diehard Democrat, and he just never saw my color as different, I guess. But in the U.S., then my husband passed away, and I didn't see. I mean, there were particularly, of course, a lot of dark men, a lot of African Americans, white men. They were all very interested in me. When I was a widow. So I'm not quite sure how to differentiate between the men in Malaysia who, and I'm not, sometimes I struggle with that. And I say, how do you, my nephews are Indians, and they refuse to date dark-skinned Indians. And I'm thinking to myself, how do you change that? How do you change that mindset? I really am not sure. They don't see the beauty in Black beauty. I used to say to them, I'm the Black beauty. So that's it. Yeah.
I was born in Malaysia, and maybe I can talk as a Malaysian male. It never, but maybe I also was not at the period in my life where I was looking at girls. So I really never, I left before that period. So it may not have been on my mind at the time, but I noticed, however, when I go to Sri Lanka, which is, I have visited Sri Lanka several times, Amanda is right. The girls doll themselves up to look very fair, but they are marrying Sri Lankan people that are much darker than I am. And I remember my father always telling me, Ken, study hard, get a good job, and you can get any woman you want. But Sri Lanka is a little different from Malaysia in many respects. But when you go to other Asian countries, let's talk about the Chinese in Malaysia, right? The girls do doll themselves up to look very Western today. I just recently saw a picture of a wedding picture of somebody, blonde haired, dolled up Chinese girl. What was also interesting for me was that the groom had dyed his hair blonde as well, and he seemed like he put on some kind of skin color. So there is this industry in the Far East that has made people think that looking Western or light skin is good. And so, and I know recently a lot of the companies like Johnson & Johnson are pulling their skin whitening products off the market. Good or bad, I don't know, right? But what has happened is people are not enjoying their own natural beauty for what they are.
I think Bob wanted to respond to Ken's earlier comment, so I think we can unmute you.
I had just a few thoughts. So I grew up in the South in West Virginia in a segregated environment. I never went to school with whites until I was 15. And there were certain norms that we enjoyed. There was an acceptance that there were various colors and different shades. I remember being confused in the first grade when I went to school and a very light-skinned girl was there. And I asked my mother when I went home, is she white? And she said no. And I remember a good friend of mine and I talking about what our ideal coloring was. And we decided that it would be a Hawaiian with a thick hair. But the idea was that not too dark, not too light, somewhere in between, about like you, Ken. And so I just wanted to kind of voice that. But then I remember when I was in seminary, I was working at a church, and there was a very dark-skinned woman there. And at one point, the story of color choice came up. And she had a very healthy attitude. She says, God has given us both white meat and dark meat. Some people like dark meat, some people like white meat, and that's okay. And that seemed to be a remarkably accepting way to kind of look at it. But I can tell you that the internalism really does visit women much more harshly than it does men. And I remember hearing that globally, the preference is for darker men and lighter women. Now, I don't know what hard evidence there is of this, except maybe there's this adage about being tall, dark, and handsome. I always wondered who they were talking about. But I think that, so that was always there. Tall, dark, and handsome was supposedly something wonderful. But I didn't hear the equivalent for women. Maybe short, light, and cute, I don't know. But this colorism stuff, Kabria, someone asked how we would ever get over it. I really think that you have to just be very, very intentional and saying, this is my choice. This is what I love. This is what I love. Happily, I grew up in the 60s, and I was able to articulate and claim an aesthetic choice that was dark. I like dark women. I was able to say that, and it really worked for me, quite nicely. But I think that has a lot to do with the times. There seems to have been a retrenchment since then. And less, so I benefited, and my age group benefited from Black is Beautiful, from all of that. All of that talk was really big when I was growing up. You know, it was, I remember it even being before the 70s, like really in late 60s. I remember, this seems to me that's when I remember this really coming forward. And it really revolutionized the way we spoke about things, what we identified as our aesthetic choices. It made it, and it liberated a lot of this colorism. But there's been a retrenchment. Just as there's been a retrenchment in other socially advanced ideals from the late 60s and 70s, there's been a retrenchment in this aesthetic broadening that I enjoyed in my late teens and early adulthood. And I've got too much background noise, so I'm gonna mute myself now.
Thank you for that. I wanted to just highlight a comment from Dr. Halliday, and then I will ask Karen's question. Dr. Halliday just said that, you know, if we think about a preference, right, it's one thing to say that, but we have to also realize that it's based in white supremacy standards of beauty. So your preference is not sort of outside of that, right? We have to think about how those systems are even impacting your preference. Preferring a color is in itself constructed through racism. So we need to be aware of that and how that's forming. Karen Moore had a question. She asks, racism and colorism are founded in slavery in the US for those of African descent. As a darker skinned African-American woman who has faced interracial and intraracial colorism, I'm curious how it has affected the Indian community in America. As an African-American who has a specific history in this country, I'm interested in knowing how another culture is affected in the US.
I think the Indians are looked at in a different. I agree that, you know, they are looked at differently because one example I can give is when I was the CIO at a medical center, I had a lot of staff, and so there were, of course, there's, you know, HR issues that went up to the EEO office. And so when I was talking to the EEO officer, you know, there were several complaints, and I said to the EEO officer, I said, they are saying something about Blackness, and I said, I'm blacker than any of them. And the EEO officer told me, it does not count. You are not considered one of them. You're different. So then, then I started to see the difference, you know, that yes, you know, I'm culturally different. You know, I may be darker skinned, but I'm culturally different. So that's one example that I can see, but Indians are looked at differently in that context.
Yeah, can I add to that? I agree, because I've had the same experience where I'm as dark as most Black people as well. And I don't culturally understand why, other than the slavery issue that has branded the African American to be that. And to answer the question about other cultures besides, you know, Asians and Indians and things like that, as somebody running responsible for the racial unity team, I have been working really hard to try to get other, you know, cultures involved in the work we are doing, because it does impact Chinese, and it does impact, you know, Native Americans and things like that. I do have a relationship with the Native Americans and some South Americans as well, but missing from the collage of people that I hope that the racial unity team will someday include, the Chinese and the Filipinos and all these other different cultures that have a story that, you know, really reflects what we're talking about, but are silent. And I think when I think about it, I think about the early immigrants from Europe that tried to assimilate into the US culture. And so they put behind their heritage and put it down like I did for a while. I think my heritage and my history is important in being voiced, but we're missing that voice of the Chinese, not a big part. Maybe they're all busy making money, like most people are, but bringing them into the conversation is so important. And I will continue to work with that, because it is that when we bring people of different cultures together to talk about it, that we come up with a real good solution.
But, you know, I think this, Amanda, I think with the recent events and all the protests, a lot of the other cultures, Chinese, Japanese, at least what I've seen on Facebook, is that they are all very interested in these racial issues. They feel that they have been targeted in this last year because of COVID coming from China. So the Chinese are also have been targeted recently, and the Japanese camps that they were in the early 1940s. So I do understand that they are very interested in getting involved. I know of at least one Chinese, several of them, but one Chinese particular, I'm going to introduce him to you, Ken, because he lives in Seattle, but I think he will be interested in helping spread the word.
So I think we have one more question, I'll have Amanda and Ken go first, and then I may add something. But sort of where do we go from here, right? What can we teach our children so they don't, repeat these stereotypes, these biases, these prejudice? What can we do?
Let me try to answer that one, because I more recently been very conscious of that with my grandchildren, and recently what I did was pull them all together and said, I've been doing a lot of research into my ancestry, and my ancestry goes back to 1750 in Sri Lanka. So I shared that with them. I pulled them before the computer and said, you know what, I've been working really hard. I started with where they are in the hierarchy and said, this is where you are and here are your parents. And I took them back to the history. They're only 12 and 13, so you can't have too long of a conversation with them. So it was about a 10-minute discussion. But I think exposing our children to our heritage, and then this includes the whites as well, because I know my wife took a DNA test and she said, I have this kind of blood. I'm even from Scotland and whatever else. And I said, those are interesting topics to talk to your children about, because at least one, you're exposing them to their diversity, even though they are white. But for my case, I wanted to make sure that my children began to not to appreciate their background and their history. And I believe at least for me, I saw that once I understood that, I became a lot more forceful in, talking about myself and my background. And it is by these conversations, I believe, that we may educate our children. But more importantly, I think it's important to have that conversation.
Yeah, this is Amanda. I do believe, getting the children of all races, like your initiatives, Ken, about bringing it into the school system, integrating, this such committees and groups into the communities, the local communities, and getting them involved you know, when you know people personally, the color doesn't matter. You know, so you need that kind of integration and support system. You need people to stand up, and you know, when you see something that's not fair, we need to stand up and speak. That's it.
Yeah, I will just echo that. I completely agree. And I think this symposium is sort of representative of what we all can do. I think that there's a lot we can teach, of course, children of color, but I agree that there's a lot that we can teach white children in particular. So I'll end by just relating a short incident that happened recently, maybe within the last year or two. So I was picking up my daughter from school, and my daughter is quite a bit lighter than I am in skin color. And I think some of her classmates, not knowing a lot about skin color, may not actually think she's Black. So they saw me picking her up, and one of her classmates came up to me and asked me, "Why are you so Black?" Right? Why are you so Black? And at the moment I was, you know, as a 5-year-old, 6-year-old, and I'm not sure what to make of the comment. You know, I'm not sure if there's some value judgment in that, right? Or if there's curiosity. So it made me think, actually, maybe this child hasn't really seen, or, you know, has maybe seen from afar a Black person, but doesn't have a Black person or darker skinned person in their family, and actually can't ask the question, right? Because I think it's not bad if kids are curious about skin color, right? It's sort of how we explain that to them. And so I was so caught off guard, I gave some sort of really silly answer, you know, but I actually think it would have been, you know, better response would have been to talk about the fact that Black is beautiful, right? To talk about pigments and different skin colors and that kind of thing. But the question caught me so off guard because I'm not used to kids asking that kind of question. I grew up in Los Angeles, California. We've got multiracial, multi-ethnic city. So I was very surprised in this area of the North Shore to get asked that question. So I think it really behooves us as parents and as teachers to really explain to children why there are different skin colors and how they are all beautiful, right? And that we don't have to add more value to one over another. So I want to turn it over now to Sophie, who's going to give us some more action items too to consider.
Awesome. Thank you all. My internet was just freezing for a second, so I want to make sure it catches up again. Okay, I think it's better. Thank you, panelists, so much. That was so incredible, such a rich discussion, and I will ask us all to maybe just pause and take a breath together, just close your eyes and kind of soak in all of the wisdom that was just shared. So let's just take a breath together. Thank you. I think it's especially important for people who look like myself, who have skin that is so white, it borders on translucent sometimes, to really hear and appreciate and accept the wisdom that comes from stories of folks who don't look like us, especially in New Hampshire. It's really, really powerful. So thank you so much, panelists, for being so candid and honest about your personal stories. It's really a powerful experience. To kind of wrap this up, I'd like to give us a summary of what our panelists talked about so that we can ruminate it on a little bit more and just remember and reflect on what we heard today. So Dr. Baumgartner talked about the paper bag test to start us off. Is your skin tone lighter or darker than a paper bag? If your skin tone was lighter, you were more accepted and you were deemed as more worthy of joining a social organization. And if it was darker, then you could be excluded from those organizations. So the acceptance of social circles was really based on the color of your skin. She also talked about how racism and colorism are part of a caste system. That system fuels whiteness. And colorism helps determine the extent to which racism hurts people. I thought that was a powerful quote. And she talked about Bluest Eye from Toni Morrison, which is a book I too would like to revisit and read. And a quote from Toni Morrison is, "I focus on something as grotesque as the demonization of an entire race could," I must have made a typo somewhere, but an entire race could take root inside the most delicate member of society, a child, and most vulnerable member, a female. In the book, the main character, Pecola, internalizes rejection and observes how lighter-skinned people are treated differently than her. And white standards of beauty and white standards of dress and white standards of class are all discussed and talked about in that book. And Dr. Baumgartner takes some hopeful things away from this book, or some key takeaways. There are alternatives that we can fix this, and one of the most powerful ways is to tell the truth about it. We need to tell the truth about what's happening. We have to challenge the accepted mythologies about beauty standards. We have to reject anti-Blackness. And often, I got my notes mixed up here. So that was, those were some really powerful takeaways from The Bluest Eye and from Dr. Baumgartner. Then we heard from Amanda Graves, and she talked about how we think we understand racism, but colorism puts it in a perspective that we have seen on so many levels around the world. She grew up in Malaysia, and she was the darkest of 9 children in her family. She was called the Blackie. All of her lighter-skinned siblings were favored over her. Her school teacher suppressed her intelligence because she had darker colored skin. In Malaysia, the first question about babies is about how fair they are, not about their health. Malaysian men were not interested in her because she was deemed too dark. And after she got married, she was really able to build her confidence in herself and her skin color. Then we heard from Ken Mendes, who talked about how race and color have played a role in his life. A DNA test showed that his genetics are from India, an Indian continent. And he wanted people to accept who he was outside of race. So in doing so, when he was raising kids, he avoided the conversation about race with his children. And he feels like that was a myth. Value is assigned by skin color. And his children are biracial, and his grandchildren are very light-skinned. So it's an interesting mix in his family. Children's books are often have white children as main characters. So what does that say to our kids? To all of our kids, light-skinned or dark-skinned, who is featured? Color blindness denies children their own cultural experience, as Ken said. And it's important to Ken that his kids and grandkids are proud of their multicultural heritage. And even though that New Hampshire is 96% white, our children will go into a diverse world, and they need to be prepared for that world. So those were some really excellent points highlighted by Ken. So thank you all three so much for your wisdom. There's some other resources we can put in the chat box about some links or poems or books that the speakers mentioned throughout this conversation. And if you enjoyed this conversation and you took something away from it, I'd ask you to donate to the Racial Unity Team, which is the nonprofit that hosted this conversation that Ken co-founded. And the Racial Unity Team is a really incredible nonprofit based in Exeter. We try and have a lot of programming that's mostly volunteer-led, such as this, but it's also really important to compensate speakers for their time. So if you got something out of this conversation, please consider donating $5, $10, $20, $50 if you can, especially if you have benefited from lighter skin privilege. You have a responsibility to help, and giving money to organizations led by people of color is one of the ways that you can participate and use that privilege for good. So please join me in donating to the Racial Unity team. You didn't have to pay for a ticket, but we do ask that if you can, please donate because it will help us provide more programming like this in the future. So with that, who am I kicking it off to end things or wrap it up? Tanisha, last words?
No, I just want to thank everyone for coming today and just reiterate what Sophie said. I won't repeat everything. And thank all of our panelists. And with that, I will turn it over to Ken for final thoughts.
Well, I'm grateful for my team of volunteers for all they do to help. We are doing a lot of work in the legislature, pushing for change. And more recently, we are trying to get the Commissioner of Education for the state of New Hampshire to release a curriculum standard that would include all missing history. The original curriculum didn't talk about the Native Americans or the African Americans. History was missing. So he has been sitting with that revised document on it. It's on his desk and it's been there for 11 months. And we have a petition out trying to get him to move, which basically calls for the commissioner to release the document for public review so that we can get it into the school system. The project was started in 2018 and here we are in 2020 and it's still not done. And two classes of graduation students have passed. We cannot wait on this. So if you are interested in reading about the petition, go to our Facebook page or to our webpage and you'll find that and you can sign that petition. Thank you all for joining us. I appreciate your time this morning. And we do not have a session next Saturday, but we'll have one the following Saturday. Next Saturday, I think the Black Heritage Trail has something. Tanisha, you want to talk about that Black Heritage Trail event? And you can find that on Black Heritage Trail website.
Sure. So we're not having our series next week because the Black New England Conference is next weekend, hosted by the Black Heritage Trail. If you have not gotten a ticket, please do so. It is a 2-day virtual conference featuring myself in the last conference, but there are tons of keynote speakers, including, let me just pull up my little handy dandy sheet here, including Essence editor Chief Susan Taylor is one of the speakers. We also have some activists speaking, Ronell from Black Lives Matter in Manchester, as well as Cheryl Lee Ralph is a keynote speaker as well. I believe tickets are for the entire weekend. You can find it on the Black Heritage Trail website. Please get a ticket. The theme is Black Women Rock. So I expect to see you all there. It should be enlightening, educational, and inspirational.
Thank you.
It is appropriate for teens. All right, have a good day, everyone, and see you on the next Zoom.